Gottfried Schlaug, a neurologist at Harvard Medical School, published a finding in 1995 that shifted the way neuroscience understood childhood development. He compared the brains of professional musicians who had begun training before the age of 7 with those of non-musicians using structural MRI. The difference was not subtle. The corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres, was significantly larger in the musicians, not slightly, measurably, structurally, visibly. The brain had physically reorganized itself around the demands of musical training, not around talent, not around passion, around the specific, repetitive, sustained act of practicing an instrument during the years when the brain was most capable of structural change. That finding was about professional musicians, but the principle applies to anyone who spent years in a music school during childhood, even if they never touched the instrument again. Because the training was never just about the instrument. The instrument was the delivery mechanism. The training went into the architecture. The first thing music school builds, and it builds this before the child has any conscious understanding of what is happening, is a delayed gratification circuit. Anders Ericsson, whose deliberate practice framework shaped decades of performance research, described the core requirement of skill acquisition: sustained effort without immediate reward, repeated over months and years, with feedback loops that are often negative. A child learning violin does not experience dopamine release after a good session, the way a child playing a video game does after completing a level. The reward is diffuse, distant, conditional. You will play this passage correctly eventually, but not today. Not this week, maybe next month. The dopamine system adapts to this timeline. Where an untrained system expects reward within minutes, the musically trained system learns to sustain effort across extended intervals without the reinforcement signal. This is not discipline in the motivational sense. This is a structural rewiring of the reward pathway during the period when the pathway is still being calibrated. By the time the child is 12 or 13, the delayed gratification circuit is not a habit. It is infrastructure. This explains a pattern that former music school students often notice about themselves in adulthood, but rarely connect to its origin. They tend to perform well in environments that require sustained effort without immediate feedback, academic research, complex professional projects, long-term creative work. They can sit with an unsolved problem for longer than average without the discomfort of not knowing driving them to abandon it. They finish things, not because they are more motivated, because the dopamine system was trained on a timeline that most people's systems have never encountered. The practice room, without anyone intending it, calibrated the reward circuitry to tolerate intervals that other systems find aversive. The discipline looks like character. It is actually wiring. The second transfer operates at the level of pattern recognition. Music is, at its computational core, an exercise in detecting, predicting, and generating patterns across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Rhythm, pitch, harmony, dynamics, structure, phrasing, articulation, all processed in parallel in real time, with error correction happening continuously. The child reading sheet music is performing a translation task of extraordinary complexity. Visual symbols are converted to motor commands across both hands at specific velocities with precise timing, while simultaneously monitoring auditory output and comparing it against an internal model of what the passage should sound like. This is not a single cognitive operation. It is a stack of parallel processes running under time pressure, and the brain builds dedicated architecture to handle the load. Moreno and colleagues demonstrated in 2011 that children who received as little as 20 days of musical training showed measurable improvements in verbal intelligence and executive function, not musical tasks, but general cognitive tasks that rely on the same pattern processing architecture. Hudziak and colleagues, in a 2014 study using cortical thickness measurements in over 200 children, found that music training correlated with accelerated development of areas involved in executive function, attention, and working memory. The brain trained on music does not compartmentalize the skill, it generalizes it. The same circuitry that tracks harmonic progressions applies to statistical patterns in data, to linguistic structures in conversation, to social dynamics in a group. Former music students often report a specific experience that is difficult to explain to people who did not go through the same training, walking into a room and sensing the emotional temperature before anyone has spoken. Reading the rhythmic structure of a conversation, knowing when a pause means discomfort versus when it means someone is thinking. Detecting when a person's verbal tone and facial expression are out of sync, the way a trained ear detects when a chord contains a note that does not belong. Knowing that a meeting is going to go badly before the first word of disagreement is spoken, simply from the tempo and dynamics of the opening exchanges. This is not intuition in the mystical sense. It is pattern recognition hardware that was installed by Bach and Czerny and Mozart, trained on harmonic tension and resolution, and applied unconsciously, automatically, continuously to everything the person encounters afterward. The instrument was the training tool. The skill migrated to every domain that contains patterns, which is every domain. The third element is harder to name because it operates in a space that psychology only recently learned to measure. Music school trains emotional processing through non-verbal channels. Justlin and Westphal, in their 2008 framework on musical emotions, identified multiple mechanisms by which music induces and modulates emotional states: brainstem reflexes, evaluative conditioning, emotional contagion, visual imagery, episodic memory activation. A child spending years engaging with emotionally charged material, a minor key passage that produces sadness without explanation, a crescendo that produces tension without narrative cause, a resolution that produces relief without anything being resolved in the real world, is practicing emotional processing hundreds of hours per year without ever naming the emotions being processed. The training is happening in the limbic system, in the insula, in the autonomic nervous system, not in the language centers. The result, in adulthood, is a person who has a deep and often disorienting capacity to feel, to be moved by a film score while everyone else is focused on the dialogue, to sense the emotional weight of a conversation before the content registers, to experience aesthetic responses that seem disproportionate to the stimulus. They feel the room change when someone enters in a bad mood. They feel the pause that carries tension before the argument starts. They feel the shift in someone's voice, the quarter tone drop that signals sadness disguised as composure, before the words have changed. These are not paranormal abilities. They are the result of thousands of hours of training in non-verbal emotional encoding and decoding, conducted in a practice room under the supervision of a teacher who may not have known that the real curriculum was emotional literacy, installed at the level of sensation rather than language. And many former music students have never connected this sensitivity, this overwhelming, sometimes exhausting capacity to feel what others do not notice, to the years they spent moving through emotional landscapes that had no words attached to them. They think they are just too sensitive. They are not. They are trained. Here is where the mechanism produces cost, because music school is not just training in processing, gratification delay, and pattern recognition. It is also training in evaluation. Every lesson is a performance. Every performance is judged. The recital is not a celebration. It is an exam with an audience. The teacher's feedback is immediate, specific, and often unsparing. A mistake is identified the moment it occurs. The child learns at a neurological level that execution is monitored and deviation is noted. Diana Kenny, in her research on music performance anxiety, documented that evaluation conditioning in young musicians produces persistent anxiety patterns that extend far beyond the stage. The amygdala learns to associate performance with judgment. And because performance, in a musical context, is deeply tied to self-expression, playing is not just executing a task, it is revealing something internal. The judgment lands on the self, not just on the output. Former music students often carry a perfectionism loop that activates in any performance context: a work presentation, a social interaction, a creative project. The internal critic that was installed by the teacher's feedback becomes an autonomous process that runs without being called. Every output is scanned for errors before it reaches the audience. The standard is not good enough. It is flawless, the way the final recital was supposed to be flawless. This produces quality. It also produces paralysis, procrastination disguised as refinement, and a chronic sense that the work is never ready. And then there is the fracture, because most people who went to music school stopped. Life intervened. A different career path, a university program that left no time, a gradual drift away from the instrument that began as a temporary pause and became permanent. The practice stopped. The lessons ended. The recitals became a memory stored in a box of programs with names and dates printed on cream-coloured paper. But the neural architecture did not dismantle. The corpus callosum did not shrink back. The delayed gratification circuit did not recalibrate to a shorter timeline. The pattern recognition system did not narrow its scope. The emotional processing channels did not close. And the evaluation loop did not turn off. Everything that music school built remained installed and operational in a person who was no longer using the application that built it. What happened was something specific and psychologically significant. A trained identity was abandoned without being resolved. The person who was a musician, who spent afternoons in a practice room, who performed under lights, who defined a portion of their developing self through the relationship with an instrument, became a person who used to be a musician. And that transition from active practitioner to former practitioner was almost never processed explicitly. There was no closing ceremony, no final conversation with the teacher that acknowledged what was ending, no farewell to the instrument that had been the primary relationship of the formative years. One day, practice simply stopped, and the days accumulated, and the identity did not resolve. It froze. And frozen identities, unlike completed ones, produce a specific kind of psychological weight. Not grief exactly. Grief requires an acknowledged ending. This is quieter. A flicker when a certain piece of music plays in a public space. Not nostalgia, but something with a sharper edge. A reluctance to talk about the years of training because the topic activates both pride and loss simultaneously. And the brain, never having processed the transition, does not know which signal to prioritize. A flinch when someone says you should play something for us, because the gap between what the hands once could do and what they can do now is a live measurement of time passing and identity shifting. The person can smile and say, "I used to play," but the word used carries a specific neural charge that the listener does not detect and the speaker does not fully understand. Erik Erikson's framework on identity formation describes identity as the product of commitments that have been explored and resolved. When a commitment is explored deeply, years of practice, emotional investment, public performance, and then abandoned without resolution, it does not integrate into the adult identity cleanly. It sits as an unresolved thread. The person built the infrastructure, inhabited the identity, and then walked away without completing the arc. The training remains, the identity does not. And the gap between the two produces a specific psychological texture. The person is shaped by something they no longer do and may not fully understand. What this means in practical terms is not nostalgia, it is a map. The person who went to music school is carrying specific neural architecture, delayed gratification circuitry that outlasts its original context, pattern recognition hardware that applies to everything, emotional processing channels that were trained without language, an evaluation loop that may still be running at full volume, and a frozen identity thread that was never resolved. None of these are disorders. None of them are gifts in the simplistic sense. They're installations. They were put in during the most plastic period of brain development, and they remain long after the instrument has been put away. Understanding what was installed is not about returning to the piano. It is about recognizing which part of the current operating system, the perfectionism, the emotional depth, the ability to wait, the tendency to scan for errors.
The unnamed sense of something unfinished was built in a practice room 20 years ago. That recognition does not require action. It requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, for a brain that was trained to perform, but never taught to process its own story, is often the piece that was missing.